People have the right to be free, but for a long time, that did not apply to any African Americans. This is because they were slaves, and slaves did not have any rights. The Underground Railroad was a way for people against slavery to help those who were enslaved. It was a simple but effective way to do this secretly and without arousing suspicion or attention. However, many people against slavery did not participate in the Underground Railroad because they were afraid of the consequences. Those who did participate helped bring freedom and peace to the lives of those enslaved.
So the Underground Railroad was a system of houses where the slaves could hide during the day when they were most visible and they're most likely to get caught, and then during the evening was when they would travel.
Slavery started in 1619 when a Dutch ship brought African slaves to Jamestown, Virginia. They started as indentured servants, meaning that in exchange for 7 years of hard work and labor, they would get land and freedom. In 1787, slavery became legalized in the northwest part of the colonies. That meant that slaves could be owned for life and were the property of their masters. With nothing but rags to wear, slaves had to work all day and sleep for just a few hours. This led to the need for the Underground Railroad.
The first Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793, but in 1850 a second act was passed. This was meant to try and lower the tension about slavery between the North and South. However, it did not help at all. The new act required all Northerners to help the Southerners find their slaves. This act also made it a complete crime to help any slaves on their journey to freedom. The new act made the Underground Railroad even riskier and made it even more dangerous for the conductors. With this most recent act, more than 300 black men were sent to the South. This act made many African Americans from the North furious.
Housing slaves was very dangerous and had severe consequences. Depending on how much you would help the escaping slaves, you could be sentenced to a lifetime in prison or even death. But why would people risk their lives for these slaves? The people who took part in the Underground Railroad felt that it was their responsibility to help the slaves get their rights back. That is why they created the Underground Railroad. It was how they fought for rights without violence.
Abolitionists were the people against slavery. Many abolitionists participated in the Underground Railroad, but many did not. The reason is the consequences for housing a slave were severe. Abolitionists created the Underground Railroad as a way to get slaves to freedom. Most of the population in the North was made up of abolitionists, but slavery was still legal. There were even some abolitionists in the South, too. The abolitionists in the South were necessary for the Underground Railroad to be successful. Without abolitionists, the Underground Railroad would not be possible.
Connecticut was one of the first colonies to legalize slavery, but was also one of the first to try and abolish it. Slavery was legalized in 1650. By the end of the 1700s, the census showed there were 5,085 African Americans in Connecticut. It was not reported how many of these people were free and how many were enslaved. Doctors, lawyers, ministers, and public officials were among some of the slave owners at the time. In 1784, the Gradual Emancipation Act was passed. This act stated that all children of enslaved African Americans would be free by the age of 25. The first abolitionist society in Connecticut was created in 1790, and finally slavery in Connecticut was outlawed in 1848. It was believed that Weston, Connecticut and the surrounding towns supported the cause of ending slavery. Aaron Buckley and his family lived in Weston from 1790 to 1864 on Ladder Hill Road North. He was a member of the Georgetown Baptist Church just a few miles from where he lived. Abolitionists gathered together in this church and several members formed the Georgetown Anti-Slavery Society on December 4, 1847. Mr. Buckley had an ice house on his property. It was like any ice house except there was a secret tunnel near the back that was used to hide slaves. In 2004, Central Connecticut State College excavated the back tunnel and found a knife, glass, and pottery that were similar to items found in other slave sites. This evidence and story supported that Aaron Buckley was an abolitionist and helped African American slaves on their way to freedom by hiding them in his ice house.
When I moved in, there was oral history about the Underground Railroad on my property. And out there is the ice house with the tunnel. and the ice house is 30 feet long by 15 feet wide. Now obviously if it has been there since the Revolutionary War, it was really used as an ice house, and when the Civil War came in the 1860s, then they decided, good place. Now the owner of this house, Mr. Buckley, was an abolitionist. And as an abolitionist, he was breaking the law because we had the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So anything he did, even in Connecticut, he did on the QT. You won't find too many people that wrote Dear Diary, today I did this and today I did that. It was very hush-hush.
Some places that slaves could have hidden include ice houses, such as Mrs. Justice's home, attics, like in Mrs. Donovan's home, cellars, and more.
The Underground Railroad was a huge secret, but how did it stay that way? Codes. People used all different kinds of codes to make sure that the escaping slaves weren't caught. Quotes, spirituals, and even just words were all saying something that people outside of the Underground Railroad would take to just be everyday things.
Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, swinging low. Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Spirituals played a big part in informing slaves about danger or threats ahead and allowed them to communicate without their slave master knowing. For example, when Harriet Tubman was in the area, people would sing Go Down Moses. If slaves heard this song, they knew she would soon help them escape to freedom.
Israel was in Egypt land. Let my people go.
Codes were also sent to slaves through quilts. Depending on their pattern, quilts told slaves to take certain actions and give them warnings and directions for their journey. The quilts would be placed on a fence so it would appear that they were just airing out, not sending a secret code. One patch called the monkey wrench told slaves that they should collect supplies for their journey. The flying geese told slaves to go in the direction of the geese overhead.
The Civil War was a bloody and treacherous time when the U.S. was divided against itself. The Emancipation Proclamation was passed during the Third Year of War by Abraham Lincoln. This abolished slavery in certain states and made the job of the Underground Railroad easier. Instead of having to escape all the way to Canada, slaves only had to escape to the northern states for freedom. However, many slaves stayed to fight for their fellow men's freedom because they were now allowed to serve in the Union Army. 200,000 black men served. This was a milestone to the end of slavery.
In 1865, slavery was outlawed, and the Underground Railroad was put to rest. African Americans had no rights during the time of slavery, and that was not completely changed. However, with the understanding that people have today, discrimination will never lead to the need for another Underground Railroad. People during the time of slavery did not accept their responsibilities and create an equal world for all, but we have now taken on that responsibility. By doing this, African Americans are closer to having the rights they deserve.
In the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble